Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third round and final round of the public meetings for the Milwaukee North-South Transit Enhancement Study. As you may or may not know, Milwaukee County asked SewerPAC to assist them in conducting this transit enhancement study. And so the transit enhancement study goes along and near 27th Street throughout Milwaukee County. So tonight on the meeting, we have myself, I'm Carrie Cooper. I'm a transportation planner for SewerPAC. We have Liz Callan from SewerPAC. We have Nikki Payne and Kevin Muse, who's our executive director. And then from Milwaukee County, we have John Rogers and Julie Esch. And from MCTS, we have Jeff Sponcia. So we're all here to answer any questions that may come up. And most importantly, we're looking for feedback on the options that we're showing and some of the analysis that we've done thus far. So, all right, next slide. Oops. So we've been doing some public outreach, and we've been working with some community partners. So we've worked with the Clark Square Initiative, Northwest Side, Century City, Triangle Park, Metcalf Park Bridges. There's Sarah from the Northwest Side. Any others who are on, you could just start cameras and wave. Via and the Near West Side. So they've been helping us out do some outreach to their individual neighborhoods, and we'll talk a little bit more about their efforts in a few slides. All right, so next slide. At tonight's meeting, we're going to go over the feedback from the last round of public involvement meetings that we had in June. We're going to go over the draft Tier 1 evaluation results. And for those of you who weren't on, we'll go over those and you'll see what those are. The preliminary Tier 2 evaluation results and next steps. And so for tonight, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can use the chat function. And we will be pausing periodically at the end of each section and asking for questions or comments before we move on to the next section. So like I said, we want to make sure that we get your feedback. So don't be shy and let us know if you've got comments or questions. All right, next slide. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why are we doing this project. And, you know, we're trying to provide some enhanced transit along this 27th Street corridor. So I guess it's important to look at the area around the corridor. So the demographics around the corridor, we have 73% of the people living in the corridor are people of color. We've got nearly 1 in 5 households without a car. Living within a half mile of the route options, and 26% of the families who live in poverty in Milwaukee County live within a half mile of the corridor as well. So, so providing, you know, enhanced transit service to these underserved populations is a priority for Milwaukee County, and we wanted to talk about some of those benefits that we would be providing. So. First thing would be faster, more reliable access to jobs, education, healthcare, and other destinations by transit. We want a better experience for transit riders with improved stations and better, more frequent service. Traffic calming and pedestrian safety enhancements near the stations, and we'll talk a little bit about those when we look at some of the dedicated lane information that we have to provide later. We want to encourage development and redevelopment near the stations, and it would provide better connections to other enhanced transit routes, such as the East-West BRT, which runs from downtown to the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center, And these two routes intersect at Wisconsin and 27th Street. So next slide. So the range of alternatives that we talked about after our last public meetings, where we're looking at the transit technologies, bus rapid transit, rapid streetcar, and light rail transit. And the route alternative options that we're looking at go from Brown Deer over to Bay Shore on, yeah, we have two options going to Bay Shore, one on Silver Spring, one on Hampton. And then the options run on 27th Street from Lisbon down to Drexel, which includes the Northwest Mutual campus in Franklin, over to Drexeltown Square in Oak Creek, and down to Ascension Hospital in Franklin. And the dash line you see on your map, that is the 30th Street rail corridor. Right now it's a freight rail corridor. So we're considering that option on the rails for the two rail options, rapid streetcar and light rail. And then we're looking at an installed paved roadway that would be next to the tracks for use as for the bus rapid transit options. So that's the basic range of alternatives that that we are looking at for the study, for the tier 1 study. All right. So we want to talk, next slide, we want to talk a little bit about public involvement, and Nikki Payne is going to present these slides.
As Carrie mentioned earlier, the study has had extensive public involvement, and now I'm going to go over some of the public engagement and feedback we've received so far. There is also a public engagement summary, which documents the details of the outreach and feedback we received. That is open for you to see. It's available for your review on the engagement page of our website, which is mkenorthsouth.com. You'll get to see that a whole lot through this presentation. So if you miss me saying it right now, you can definitely see it a little later. The website is both in English and in Spanish, but the public involvement summary is only in English. So if you would like a copy of the document in Spanish, please just let us know. Next slide. Throughout the last several months, we have continued to work with our community partners to do ongoing public service engagement along the corridor. Our focus was on traditionally underserved communities. In late June and early July, we finished up the bus survey, and of the 1,500 surveys that were distributed, 490 responses were received. And for any of you that know anything about marketing, when you get 10%, which would have been 150, that's a great response. We did well. People seem to be very encouraged and want to participate in this study. Community partners have also been doing mail drops in the neighborhoods along the corridor and sharing information about the study at community events. Our project staff has also been sharing information weekly at the Fondy Farmers Market and other community events since August. Online input opportunities were also available on the project website for a month after the last round of meetings, and will also be available after this round of public meetings. So open comments regarding the study can be provided at any time. Next slide. During the second round of public meetings in June, we had a total of 67 virtual meeting registrants and 75 during the first round in February. The recordings of the public meetings are also posted to the website for people to view at any time. There were 132 responses to the 3 online surveys. And out of the 1,500 bus stop surveys, the community partners received 400 returned responses, as I mentioned earlier. And the study team has completed more than 80 stakeholder meetings with local officials, neighborhood groups, advocates, and others since the beginning of the study. Next slide. Some of the high-level themes from the second round of public involvement were similar amounts of support for BRT, rapid streetcar, light rail. And as you're kind of seeing those words a little bit bigger and stand out a little bit more in the word cloud, you can see what people were interested in. There was also strong support for transit-only lanes and significant support for the route option to Brown Deer, both on street and via the 30th Street rail corridor, and on the north end and Drexel Town Square on the south end of the route. So as I mentioned, the word cloud is on the right side of the slide that was created and using the open-ended comments from round 2. The size of the word represents how many times it came up in the public comments. Rail and BRT both stand out as frequent comments. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Nikki. So any questions or comments on what's been presented so far? Anything? No. All right, well, next we'll move on to the draft Tier 1 evaluation results. So yes, so we're looking at the range of alternatives that I described earlier. And we'll go over those in detail a little bit later, especially the bus transit technologies, bus rapid transit, streetcar, and light rail. We'll talk about those a little more in detail. But again, on the right were the routes that were also considered as part of the Tier 1. Next slide. So we also included a no build option. And this represents what exists today. As you can see on the right, there's the MCTS purple line, which is the no build option. So it's sort of like, what if we didn't do anything in this quarter? What would we have? And we'd have the purple line, which runs mostly on 27th Street and makes its way over to Bayshore and down to IKEA in Oak Creek. And so really it's used as a base to compare the other alternatives. So that is our no build option. Next slide. So for the 3 transit types, bus rapid transit, rapid streetcar, and light rail, they all have similarities in that they would all have enhanced stops, or we call them stations, with offboard ticketing, level boarding, so that strollers, wheelchairs, and carts can be rolled right onto the bus from the station, no stairs. And there would be notification in the station for when the next transit vehicle is arriving. So it's a little more user-friendly when you're waiting for the vehicle. But for bus rapid transit, the bus would run in the roadway and it would have at least 50% dedicated lane just for the BRT service. Its stations would be spaced about a half mile apart. For rapid streetcar, that would run on the street as well, but on tracks that would be installed in the roadway. And the route would be at least 50% in dedicated lanes. And station spacing would be about a quarter mile to a half mile apart. So it's a little bit different than the Milwaukee hot, but the tracks and the vehicle are similar. For light rail, we have, again, it would be on the roadway, with the tracks would be installed on the roadway. Here you can see there's a little bit of a separation between the transit vehicle and the regular traffic lanes. And for light rail, the route is usually entirely or nearly entirely in dedicated lanes, with station spacing a half mile or more apart. So those are the transit vehicle options. So then we looked at some factors that we use to evaluate those transit technology types. So we looked at typical capacity, so kind of a right size mode for this corridor. How many riders do we expect, and which service would be able to handle those riders the best? Typical service characteristics, kind of the scheduling, frequencies, time of day, environmental characteristics, potential to bring in development or catalyze those developments, consistency with corridor character, which is sort of like, what's there now and what would fit in best with the neighborhood, consistency with local and regional plans. So we looked at the sewer 2050 plan, Vision 2050, and the local city and neighborhood plans to see, what are they planning for? Is it, enhanced transit or just the service that's there today and those kinds of things. And then we looked at typical per mile capital costs. So with all of these together, you can kind of see light rail has a couple red dots and, green, yellow, and red represent, green is the best, yellow is medium, and red is kind of not the best. So with the typical per mile capital cost, there's a big difference there between light rail, streetcar, and BRT. With BRT, it can basically use what's on the roadway right now, just with a little bit of a striping change. And with light rail and rapid streetcar, we have those installed rails in the roadway, and most likely there would be some overhead catenary wires to power the vehicles for the rail options. In the case of light rail, there's also a safety gate that would be required at some intersections. So all of those things add up. They would all have the same relative costs for the improved stations, but that's where the cost landed. So with all of these factors considered, we decided to advance the bus rapid transit into the tier 2 evaluation. And we're not saying, we did get a lot of comments regarding rail. So we're not saying, rail couldn't be considered in this corridor at some time if there was, more transit funds available. But at this time, that's where we are. So we're moving with West Rapid Transit, and next slide. And then all of those same route options would be available for Bus Rapid Transit, except on rail on the 30th Street corridor. That is the paved roadway that would be installed next to the rails on the 30th Street corridor. So, all right, next slide. So for those routes, we also did an evaluation of those with several factors. So we have each of the transit routes are listed on the left, and then the factors that we considered are at the top. So the segment characteristics, we looked at population and employment centers that would be served, as well as points of interest in the corridor. For congestion, we were looking at basically traffic congestion and where we would have some opportunities to have a dedicated lane for BRT. And then accessibility, we were looking at those underserved populations. So better service for people of color, low income populations, those with disabilities, and those who don't have access to a car. And for environmental impacts, we looked at parklands and other natural areas around the transit route alignments, but since those wouldn't disturb any of those factors, they all got a green. Consistency with corridor character, again, that's sort of looking at, does this make sense to put BRT on each of these route options? And the north option 4 got a red there. That's the 30th Street corridor. And that was basically because it's a rail corridor for one thing. And then most of the developments or the businesses along that 30th Street corridor, the rails are to the back of those developments. And some of the access to the rail corridor just wasn't as easy as the on-street option. So that one got a red. And again, we're not saying that, the 30th Street corridor shouldn't be used for passenger service. In fact, we are looking at including an appendix to the tier 1 analysis that would talk about how the 30th Street corridor could be used as a commuter rail corridor that would serve the 30th Street corridor, but would really best serve from the 30th Street corridor to downtown and beyond. So, so we will have some information available on our website about that as well. So in the evaluation, the North 1 option, North 2 option to Bay Shore via Silver Spring, we're moving forward with those. The central segment, of course, from 27th Street or on 27th Street from Lisbon to Drexel, then to Northwestern Mutual Campus in Franklin, Drexel Town Square on Drexel, and to Ascension Hospital in Franklin. Now the North option 1 and South option C to Brown Deer and Ascension of Franklin, those far north and south segments. Those tend to get less dense with population and development, and the length is, it gets a little longer to those destinations. So we've carried those forward, but they may not make it through to the next round, or we may consider something called an open BRT system, where like every other bus would serve those options. So one bus would go to Bay Shore, the next would go to Brown Deer, one bus would go to Drexel Town Square, the next would go to Ascension and Franklin. So we wanted to keep those on the table, and so we're looking at those in a little more detail. All right. So after that evaluation, we have the remaining range of alternatives. We have the bus rapid transit as the transit technology, and the routes that we're looking at go from Brown Deer over to Bay Shore, along Teutonia, connecting to 27th Street, all the way down to Drexel, to the Northwestern Mutual Campus, over to Drexel Town Square, and down to Ascension Hospital in Franklin. So that is what we have carried through to Tier 2. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about the feedback that we've received, because we did show these options at the last round of public meetings. And so some of the feedback that we got, we asked folks how well they think each transit type would fit within this 27th Street corridor specifically. This is the little chart on the right. And so they're all fairly similar, but BRT did get slightly more support. And then with the route options on the left, 30th Street Rail Corridor got a lot of support. So did the option to go up to Brown Deer, Bay Shore via Silver Spring, and then Bay Shore via Hampton also got some support. And on the south route options, Drexel Town Square got the most support, followed by Ascension Hospital in Franklin, and then Northwestern Mutual Campus in Franklin. So, all right. So any questions regarding the Tier 1 evaluation that we've gone through so far? Anything?
We do have
chats here.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got some interesting questions in the chat here.
Okay.
And I was writing a long answer to Michael, but it's probably quicker to answer it verbally since it's a good time to pause. So Michael Dunst asked, speaking of county funding, how does that relate to the usual discussion of the state not funding transit? And also, would this project depend on any state funding or approvals? So a little bit of a long answer just to make sure everybody's got the same general picture. So the state of Wisconsin doesn't usually provide capital or construction funding for transit projects. That is something that could change with any state budget. The legislature and the governor could come to an agreement on that if they would like to fund that. But historically, that's not generally happened. The state does provide a fair amount of operating support for MCTS, though, as part of the regular biennial state budget. Although, again, right now that is lower than usual due to some actions on the state legislature during the current budget period that was just adopted this past summer. So this project is not counting on state funding. And Carrie will get to this actually almost at the very end of the meeting. So I'm going to steal a little bit of her thunder here, but we are, if the county decides to pursue this project, we're thinking that it should be eligible for a federal transit program that supplies up to 80% of your capital or construction costs. So that's what will be pursued with a local match from the county. As far as, and then finally, he asked if the project would depend on any state funding or approvals. So no, not counting on state funding. Obviously, if the state wishes to be a funding partner, I'm sure the county would welcome that. But that's not what we're counting on right now. As far as approvals, it is the southern portion of the project is on a state highway. So we are working closely with WISDOT as we explore different cross sections, which Liz will be going through soon. And we will need to work with WISDOT on, maybe if it is determined to reallocate some road space to just transit lanes, that is something we'll have to work with the state on. So hopefully those answered your questions. Jose asked, what's the rough estimated cost for the BRT option compared to that 1.2-ish billion low end for a HOP service? And again, we're going to talk about that, but it's about 130 to 180 million. Those are very, very early estimates because we don't have any engineering or design done yet. This is just a planning study, and Carrie will go through that in more detail. So it's about an order of magnitude or times 10 basically difference between bus versus rail.
Yeah, so Brian asked, have you considered a loop covering Northwestern, Ascension, and Drexel? So we are considering covering those in some ways in that tier 2 evaluation, but also MCTS has been in conversation with Franklin for a while, and they may have some other service that's provided there that would give them a connection to the BRT. It's all kind of early right now, but we're definitely in conversations with Oak Creek and Franklin on those.
We did also get a question on why doesn't the city and the county coordinate on a project of this nature? We're not ruling that out. That's certainly something that if the various elected officials align on wanting to make an investment in that way in a coordinated fashion, that could occur. Traditionally, transit has primarily been the county's responsibility, and so that is, that's generally the frame that it's coming from. But that doesn't mean that the county and the city couldn't coordinate further. When it comes to, if there's a road resurfacing happening or something like that, they do try to coordinate those things. And in fact, it's not the city in this case, but actually the state is going to be doing a resurfacing in part of the corridor about the same time that we think this project might be implemented. And we are trying to work with the DOT to coordinate those investments so we're not duplicating or re-tearing up or anything like that, what they're doing. So I can't speak to the elected officials particularly, because I think what you're asking, David, is, why doesn't the city TIF to support the county transit system? And that's really a question maybe for elected officials more than the project team. I don't know, Carrie, which ones you want to do which here. I guess I could take John's, which is about the infrastructure bill, and maybe you could take David's other question that's here. So John asked, is there any anticipated funding for the federal infrastructure bill that might be passed soon? Maybe. So the issue with the infrastructure bill is that it hasn't been passed yet, and things could always change. But if it does end up coming out of the House, much like it did in the Senate, yes, we would think that there would be at least a little increase in funding to the county transit system as part of that bill. Mostly what it appears they did is kind of plus up a lot of existing programs, plus up meaning add a lot more money to existing programs. So that doesn't necessarily change the need to identify a 20% local match for any federal capital funding as part of the infrastructure bill. And so that's, that's the limitation. And I hope I'm making that clear. That's the financial limitation on a large capital investment by the county is that 20% local match and the ability to have a revenue source to find that local match. And so that probably would, I have not seen anything that indicates that that will change under the transportation bill for any of the typical main transit programs. Carrie, did you want to try to tackle the trip times question?
Sure. I guess, what might be a bigger consideration for trip times is that dedicated lane. That's where we're really going to see the travel time savings. Where the buses or trains or whatever, they would be in their own lane, they wouldn't be held up by traffic. And also, I didn't mention this before, but at the signals, we're also looking at transit signal prioritization so that when the transit vehicle is at a signal, they would get the priority to go through before the rest of the vehicles would go through. So those things might make a bigger difference. I don't know, Kevin, if you, between the modes, if you in general.
I think the way we had envisioned and described rapid streetcar and BRT, the concept is that the travel times would probably be pretty similar between the two. There might be a little bit more reliability with BRT because of the ability to go around an obstacle should something go wrong, whereas a vehicle on tracks can't do that. Light rail does typically have better trip times for kind of two reasons. So one is that if you're really going to do light rail, you don't ever mix with traffic, at least at any location other than an intersection. So that usually involves, a more aggressive amount of dedicated medians or lanes than what you would see with many BRT or rapid streetcar implementations. And then the other thing is that usually light rail stops or stations are further apart. A half mile is usually kind of the minimum, and a lot of them across the country are more like a mile apart or more in many locations. And so that would be another reason that might have, another thing that might cause some travel time savings. So, we don't have the traffic modeling done yet to estimate the differences between those two. We certainly could give it a shot, but it is, there definitely would be differences in the travel time savings for light rail versus BRT or rapid streetcar. How big those are, I can't really comment. Experience elsewhere would say it would be usually a couple miles an hour faster on average. That's usually what similar corridors across the country experience in the difference. So.
Yeah, and as Jeff Sponcia from NCTS said in the chat, the dwell times would be reduced with level boarding. So, the drivers don't have to come out and assist folks getting up and down the stairs, and all door boarding. So it's just a faster loading and unloading at each of the stops. So that would help save time as well. All right. Anybody else? Or did we cover all the questions?
Everything I saw, yep.
Okay. All right. So the next section we're going to go over is the tier 2 analysis, and Liz Callan from SewerPack is going to cover those. So, Liz.
All right. We'll jump right in here. So the tier 2 evaluation is going to be a more detailed analysis of the evaluation that we did in tier 1. We're going to be taking the alternatives that Carrie showed in that last slide. So looking at BRT and then those route options that she showed. And we're going to be doing a more detailed evaluation of those options. And that is going to look at several different factors. Some examples of things that we're going to be looking at are factors related to how a bus rapid transit service in the corridor would work with bus only lanes, understanding kind of the benefits and impacts of those, and what the roadway configuration options for those are. We're also going to be doing a more detailed station area analysis, ridership estimates, cost estimates, and then a high level environmental evaluation. So this is not the environmental review process that will be done in the in the design and engineering phase of this project. But it's just kind of a high level look at things. And then tonight we're going to go through a few of the things that we found so far through our initial evaluations, but we are really kind of in the earlier stages of this tier 2 evaluation. So we're going to show you what we've got so far, and hopefully we can get some feedback on that. And then as we do have other things to share, we will be doing that through our website. So understanding where bus only lanes can go in the corridor is a major part of the tier 2 analysis. And so the map on the right here is showing what conversion options exist in the corridor. So the segments that are in this turquoise color on the far north and far south end are segments where there is a wide shoulder that could be converted to a bus only lane. The segments in yellow are areas where a travel lane would be converted to a bus only lane. And then the segment in purple is an area where an option does not exist to convert a travel lane to a bus only lane because there's only one drive lane in each direction. So that's a segment where we would be looking at converting parking and in some cases a parking and a bike lane to a shared bus bike lane in order to get some kind of dedicated lane in that segment. There are a few portions, particularly at the very end of the route options, where we wouldn't expect to have a dedicated lane, pretty much based on what the roadway is like in that area, and those are in that dark gray color, just those few spots on there. So what are the benefits of bus only lanes? So as Carrie kind of mentioned in the last Q&A portion of the meeting, this is going to be one of the biggest things that is going to impact and improve that reliability of the service, and then also improve travel times. So that's going to allow the bus to avoid traffic and then other kind of impediments in the roadway. It can also provide traffic calming depending on how it's implemented, which can improve safety. And we have continued to hear a lot of feedback about reckless driving and traffic safety and pedestrian safety in the corridor. So that's something we're looking closely at and trying to understand, how can we, best recommend these lanes so they do have that effect. And then, along with those benefits, there are some other impacts that would come about with dedicating part of the roadway to transit that isn't currently dedicated to that. So in some cases, we are, we do understand that there will be some traffic delays in some locations during short periods of the day. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next. In the cases where parking would be reallocated for transit, there would be a reduction of that on-street parking for residents and businesses. And then in some locations, there are bike lanes that may need to be modified. And so we'll continue to talk about that as we go throughout the next several slides here. So our initial really high level traffic analysis is showing that there are going to be some areas where drivers would experience some delay during peak times in select locations by 2045. And so we have those segments circled on the map here. As part of this study, we are going to also do a more detailed intersection level traffic analysis that will, help us understand more about what's going on in these locations and give us even a better idea of what the actual traffic impacts would be. But that is what we're seeing from our initial traffic analysis. But what does that really mean? What does significant traffic delay on a surface street mean? So it can mean different things, of course, depending on how severe we're talking about. But really, we're talking most likely about waiting for more than one traffic signal cycle at an intersection. Again, just during those, pretty specific times of day. And then in some cases, slower driving speeds just as a result of having more cars in less lanes at one time. So some of the configuration options that we're looking at as far as where in the roadway would the bus only lane be located and sort of how would that roadway be configured are going to be shown. We're going to show those in the next 5 or 6 slides. These are examples throughout the corridor. As we move forward with the study, we are going to provide some of these cross sections and what options are available throughout the length of the corridor. But this is just kind of a sampling of that. So starting on the far north end in the Brown Deer area on Teutonia between Bradley and Calumet, the existing cross section is 2 travel lanes in each direction, relatively wide median and then this paved shoulder on each side. So we've got a couple different options here. You know, that in this case, the paved shoulder could be converted to a transit only lane, either on the outside or the inside. So a center running option could be looked at in this area where you would utilize the median for those stations. Continuing down the corridor on 27th Street from Cornell to Atkinson, this segment has one drive lane in each direction, although it's relatively wide. It's about 16 feet in each direction right now, and then an 8-foot parking lane. And so essentially what could be done in this segment would be making those drive lanes a little bit narrower, which is still well within kind of a recommended width of a drive lane, 11 feet, and then have a shared bus bike lane, in this case on the outside of the roadway. And in this cross section, we are showing these curbs here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about different options to actually physically separate a transit lane from a drive lane, understanding, you know, there are some pretty significant reckless driving concerns in this corridor. We don't want to move forward with recommending an option where a bus lane is now going to become a right-hand passing lane, making it even easier than it might currently be to speed and do different things that, you know, is obviously not something, you know, people want in this corridor, or things that are going to reduce safety. So that these are things that we're going to look at, and I have some actual images that will show, but you'll see these different examples in some of the cross sections. And then as far as the shared bus bike lane portion goes, this segment doesn't currently have bike lanes, but there are bike lanes throughout a good portion of this segment, and actually even throughout a good portion of the southern segment. So where those bike lanes do exist, of course, you know, we would want to try to maintain those, and then if possible, connect some of those gaps that are out there, especially when looking at a shared bus bike lane, which is not ideal, but there are some options that you could put in place to improve kind of that experience. So one of those things is a channeled bike lane at stations, where the bike lane actually goes around the outside of the station, just at the location of the station, which would provide an opportunity for the biker to pass the bus as it stopped at the station. So we'll also talk about that a little bit in more detail as well. Continuing south on 27th Street from North Ave to Lisbon Ave. Somewhat of a similar existing roadway here, although this is one of those segments that does have that dedicated bike lane in place. And so then we would be looking at having a shared bus bike lane along the outside with, again, keeping those two travel lanes, of course, in the middle, and basically some kind of separated barrier possibly in this location. On the 27th Street Viaduct, which is that long bridge that goes over the Menominee Valley, there are two lanes in each direction, a bike lane and then this painted buffer. So an option on the viaduct would be to convert one of these travel lanes to a bus only lane, and then retain the bike lanes in each direction, with of course retaining that sidewalk and basically eliminating this painted buffer in the middle in order to have enough room for those bus lanes. One thing I'll talk about as we move on to stations is whether or not you know, we should recommend a station on the viaduct itself. And so that's a configuration that would have to be looked at, and how would, you know, the bus lanes work with a station on the viaduct, and just some of the kind of more detailed questions that might come along with that might alter how exactly this is laid out here. That's just one example. Continuing south on Layton Boulevard between National and Lincoln, we have two drive lanes in each direction and a parking lane. So in this case, we could convert one of those drive lanes to a transit lane, but since the existing lanes are relatively narrow and the parking lane is relatively narrow, we likely would not be able to retain parking. So we'd actually kind of be looking at converting a drive lane and parking potentially in this area. Now there's a few different options that could be looked at. So again, this is just our initial analysis, but in this case, we do have kind of some space left over, which could be used to actually have a dedicated bike lane. So you could have a dedicated bus lane, a dedicated bike lane, and then potentially have some kind of protection in this area. In this segment, we do have that median, so a center running bus lane could also be considered. Continuing south 27th Street from Layton to College. This segment has 3 drive lanes in each direction. It does not currently have parking or a bike facility, but does have a wide median. So in this case, an option could either be a dedicated shared bus bike lane on the outside, or a center running option, utilizing again that median for the stations. And I meant to mention this earlier, but just a few of the benefits of center running. So you might be wondering, why would you want the bus lane on the center versus on the outside? And so center running bus lanes can help even more with reliability because there's less interaction along the right side because you've got people turning in and out of driveways and just more right turns happening where people would be having to cross over into that bus lane to turn. So you've got less interaction with other vehicles. So it really just improves the reliability. And then there can also be a pedestrian safety kind of enhancement with this, because even though people do have to cross into the median to get to the stations, it's actually kind of cutting the crossing distance in half, because regardless of whether you're coming or going, at some point in your transit trip, you're going to have to cross the full length of that roadway, assuming you're coming back to the same place you started, just based on the direction of traffic. So this actually can improve that, because you're just going to have to make that half cross twice instead of fully crossing the one time. So it can be just easier and more convenient for pedestrians to make that cross. And they would be located at intersections where there are dedicated pedestrian crossings, and in some cases safety enhancements might be necessary, but that would be, I think, regardless of whether the station was on the outside or in the center. So I'm seeing a few questions in the chat about some specific segments, but I'm gonna continue through the rest of these cross sections, and then we can pause and see if there's any questions about these. This is actually the last one I'm going to show, and this has 27th Street from College to Sycamore. Sycamore is the area where there is a Walmart in Franklin down here. So this segment has 3 drive lanes in each direction and a dedicated bike lane. So in this segment, we would be looking at converting one of those drive lanes to a bus lane. And again, this could be either curbside or next to the bike lane, or along the median in a center running lane. I'm actually going to go through 2 more slides and then I'll pause for questions because these are related. So continuing to talk about protecting those bus only lanes. So we recognize, and we've already heard from people, that paint might not prevent drivers from using those lanes, particularly in some areas of the corridor where reckless driving is really a severe issue. And so some of these physical barriers that could be looked at are shown here. Different kinds of, in this case, large bumps that are kind of precast concrete here, either precast or cast in place concrete curb with some kind of maybe delineator here, and then more of kind of a rigid bollard that's kind of basically like drilled into the roadway. The reason we're wanting to show these and talk about these is because we we recognize this concern, and we also recognize that, you know, plastic delineators also might not be enough. So these are a few things that could be considered. Of course, consideration would have to be given to things like snow removal, other maintenance activities, and also depending on where the lane is located, how many kind of gaps you would need in that. So along, you know, if you do have a right side or a curbside running lane, and you've got a lot of driveways and a lot of intersections, you know, it may or may not make sense to put a physical barrier in that is going to have a lot of gaps in it to allow that traffic to cross. So I think this is another reason why the center running configuration would make a lot of sense in some portions of the corridor, because you do have, you know, an opportunity to actually have some of that physical protection, you know, be more continuous throughout that lane. And then just to come back around to the interaction with bikes in the bus lane, you know, this is something we're looking at and we'll continue to look at. Would appreciate, you know, feedback on this specific topic. But in some cases along the corridor, just because of the width that's there, you know, there just wouldn't be enough room to have both a dedicated bike lane and a dedicated bus lane. So we could be looking at shared bus bike lanes in some portions of the corridor, which is not really a, you know, it's not an ideal situation, but it could be an option to just provide that facility. And then where necessary, you know, bike channels could be provided to allow space for the bicyclists and buses to kind of get around the buses. But obviously this could also be used, you know, if a bike lane was continuous along the corridor as well. So like I mentioned, I'm going to just pause there because I think I'm seeing some questions about some of the configuration options.
Yeah, Liz, I can take what I think is the first one, unless somebody sent you one directly. So we did answer in the chat about the stretch from State to St. Paul, just north of the viaduct. That is an interesting stretch. So between Highland and Wisconsin, there's relatively heavily used parking. There's also some traffic calming measures that have been put in by the city and actually enhanced by the Near West Side partners recently with some planters. And so you know, in that area, given how narrow the road is, if we did want a dedicated lane, we'd be talking about removing all of that. And so that is one of the things we're going to get feedback on from the neighborhoods, from people attending tonight, and try to understand what the appetite is for that. You know, if we don't get a dedicated lane in that stretch, there may be some creative things we can do with the signals to make sure that the bus can move through that area quickly. Because it is a relatively short stretch. I think it's maybe 4-ish blocks, 5-ish blocks at most there, if I'm counting right. And so there, you know, if you time the signals right and give the bus some signal priority, you might be able to get through there without too much difficulty. South of Wisconsin, at least during most times, there isn't a lot of parking permitted in the curb lane. It usually is two driving lanes in each direction, at least during peak hours. And so if that's still how it looks, although I probably should go drive over there because this stuff can change any day. But based on what last time I was over there earlier this year, you know, that would be an option to just take a travel lane in that area. And that would be something we would explore, obviously, with the city and the neighborhood again and the Near West Side partners. So hopefully that answered that question. That was from John. Brian, I guess I'll just ask you if what we're showing here right now helps explain what your next question there was. So Brian was asking about sorry, just scrolling struggles. Do buses have flashing indicators to show when they're unloading or loading? And in the options with bike lane next to the bus lane, I'm wondering how people would leave the bus without being run over by a bike. So this is the way that this is typically addressed. It's an island platform separated from the curb and then areas to cross. If you're looking for an example of this in the city, right near the public market, just across the street at Cafe Benelux, southeast corner of Broadway and Broadway and St. Paul. there is one of these already for the streetcars. So there's an island platform a little bit away from the curb, and then a dedicated bus lane that runs between the platform, the streetcar station, and the sidewalk. And typically, no, the buses wouldn't have any flashing indicators beyond just, brake lights to let people know that they were stopped at a station. I don't know, Liz or Carrie,
Yeah.
if you want to
This
tackle
is
any
Brian.
others.
And that was the point. I was just, were you using that for every stop, or are you going to use that for just part of an area? So thank you for clarifying. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and one of the kind of restrictions with this is going to be the space that's available. So I think, we would have to, or actually probably the next phase of this project would probably really have to take a close look at where that would fit. And if it, doesn't fit, what are the other options if you do have a bike lane there, and how exactly are you going to, make sure the bus isn't just driving into that bike lane and different pieces like that. Okay, so benefits of curbside versus center running. I feel like I covered that. So if you have any other questions, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, maybe one of the questions, maybe it wasn't clear that if the bus is center running, it would load, the doors would be on the left side of the bus rather than the right side. So next to the platform of the station. I'm not sure if that's answering one of the questions.
Yeah, that's a good, that's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. And I don't want to confuse people. You don't have to do it that way. There is a solution that doesn't do it that way, but we'll not worry about that right now at this point in the study. The really key thing is just what Liz talked about as far as conflicts. So if you've got a lot of, in particular, business access, but business or residence access directly onto 27th Street or the street you're on, then a curb lane becomes also a right turn lane, and that is less efficient to move the transit vehicle through as opposed to a center running lane. So.
Okay, just some comments about bike lanes, saying they really need to be fully protected, especially on 27th. And let's see.
Yeah, Andrew's asking a little bit more about the island platforms, if it's center running lanes, and so there's kind of an assumption in there that many people would be making symmetrical journeys, so to speak. So if you do happen to say you live in the north side on this route, towards the north, and you work at St. Luke's, yes, if we were doing side curb running lanes when you got off to work to go to work, you wouldn't have to cross the street. But then when you're done with your shift, you would have to cross the street across all the lanes of traffic in that location to get to the other side where the platform would be. Whereas if you do center running lane, you have to cross and center platforms, you have to cross half the street both times, from the center to the western side of the street where St. Luke's is. So if you're making a round trip, it kind of doesn't matter too much. And in fact, some people do prefer center running just because there's less to cross at any given moment. But as far as the overall distance somebody might be likely to have to cross during the day, it should be about the same between the two options.
Yeah, and I think with this corridor, the crossing distance is only really an issue kind of once you get to the further southern portion of the corridor, because those are, many people on the call are probably familiar, those are really, really wide streets. And for some people that can be intimidating, just the thought of having to get to that station. So I think in some cases it could be, just helping the service be more accessible to people. But yeah, it is kind of right, assuming you're making a symmetrical journey and things like that. So just some comments on people, someone said they like the center running option. How much space would there be at the center stops? Would there be enough space for an above normal number of waiting? So that is something that, would really have to be looked at too once whether the decision is made to pursue center running and or looking at the specific station locations, is how much width is there. In some cases, or in a lot of cases, the median does narrow toward the intersections because you've got turn lanes in place. So, you know, then you might be looking at like far side stops or different things. So I think having or center block kind of stations or something like that. I think once you know we get to that detailed portion of this study, which again may or probably will not be something that we do in this study, you know, that's something that would have to be looked at is what is the width there, how much width is needed for the actual, you know, the platform, the shelter, and then making sure there's enough space for people waiting. But there are some examples of center running or center stations for the hop. So that's a, you know, an example that can be looked at as well to sort of just see how that, you know, geometrically works.
Yeah, I think and just acknowledging David had a better example than I had along Ogden and Astor for some different ways, is that the station platforms and the bike lane can interact. And yes, that is a good point. I had forgotten about that. Lots of interesting comments. Peter's asking what would the BRT use as an example, as a fuel source to get around. So we're not going to commit the county to anything here, but I will note the East-West BRT is using battery electric buses, so no local emissions directly from the bus. And so, you know, we'd expect that would at least be a consideration going forward as part of this project too. A similar type of rapid charging battery electric bus might be a good option. Certainly, particularly the near south side and even more so the north side of this corridor does experience you know, higher levels than normal of air pollution related to transportation. And so anything we can do in this project to reduce that and noise and vibration is a good thing.
All right, so we can keep moving through the presentation, but I think, you know, the comments specifically, you know, comments on areas, specific areas along the corridor are great. So, I mean, keep those coming as well as general questions and comments. So just kind of going back. So just moving on to stations. So the stations that we would be looking at for BRT in this corridor would be the same that the East-West BRT is currently constructing for that service. Or, you know, we're kind of moving forward with the assumption that they would be the same. This rendering shows one of those stations on Wisconsin and Water, and this is, again, just a rendering. So once we have that service, you know, up and running or it's testing, we'll be able to actually show some images and people will be able to see those around the area. But the features of these stations are level boarding, high quality shelters with seating, off-board ticketing, real-time bus arrival information. They'd be accessible as far as people using different mobility devices. Someone with a stroller could roll right on, etc. And then there would, you know, there is dedicated lighting as well at the stations, which is something that we did here in several of the comments early on in the study was the need to have lighting. Just right off the bat, I see a question about, has heating been considered? That is used in some cities at stations. And I think I would say, you know, that's certainly something that, you know, could be up for consideration. There is, for snow removal, there is actually going to be heating underneath the pavement at the stations. But that wouldn't really be expected to, you know, provide enough heat to really feel a lot of warmth at the station, but that's, you know, sort of a
Liz, just to clarify, that's the East-West BRT is doing that. So
yes,
this project could do the same.
This project could do that. You're right. Yeah, sorry. So, but as far as heat at the station, that is certainly a comment that we could include that is not currently included in the East-West BRT stations.
Yeah, and we did actually in our the survey that we handed out at the bus stops along with our community partners, we did ask about those types of features, and heating and or cooling at the stops or stations was one of the more common things requested. I think it was one of the more popular options. So that is definitely something we're planning to take into consideration as the project moves forward. And yeah, definitely noting that the both Minneapolis and Chicago do have heating. And somehow miraculously, whenever I stand under those ones on the L platforms, they've never lit a platform on fire as far as I know, but they generate a lot of heat. So they're very effective at that.
All right, so then just moving on to talk a little bit about station locations. So this map on the right does show some of those preliminary station locations at the intersection level. So again, as a part of this study, we won't actually identify the exact location of each station, but we're thinking that station pairs would be located for the most part at or near these intersections listed. Again, these are still preliminary, so we're still very much, taking comments on all of this. And for the most part, they're spaced a quarter to a half mile apart. They're at intersections with other major streets, transit routes, and important destinations. And then we'll be taking a deeper look into ridership at each station, access as far as equity goes, as well as just general population and job access around each station. And then the 3 stations in the middle here are near the viaduct, and they are kind of still up for consideration as far as whether or not there should be a station at the viaduct or if there should be a station adjacent to the viaduct. I had a couple of dogs break into my office here, so you're seeing some movement in the background. Those are my pets. All right, so then just the last slide about stations. This slide shows the average number of people and jobs within a half mile of stations by route option. So the turquoise color is showing the population, and then the gray is showing the number of jobs. So you can see, among these options, among the northern option, Bayshore stations along that Bayshore route that we're considering would serve slightly higher average number of people and jobs, and then same for the Drexel Town Square option, but again, they're all pretty similar. And then this is, just one of the things that we're going to be looking at to help understand where station should be located, and then which route options would serve the most people and jobs.
Liz, we did get a question about related to the stations before you move on, what extent park and ride would be applied to these stations, park and ride lots. So at this point, we're not necessarily getting to that level of analysis, but there definitely are some places it may make sense to think about, and probably a lot of places it doesn't. So, it's not, the county wouldn't plan on buying a bunch of land to either put in a structure or a lot, but there are some places, either, depending on what alternative we end up with. For instance, on the northern end, there's already a park and ride lot at Bayshore that this service could make sure to serve. Similarly, there may be some locations that are essentially, already available that could serve as park and rides, either, near 894 or further south on the southern end of this corridor too. There are several large parking lots near potential places that stations may be. So, I don't want anyone to get the idea that we're talking about putting a bunch of structured parking along the corridor or something like that. That's definitely not part of this project. But there may be places where it's relatively easy to take advantage of existing services existing lots, or maybe lots that could easily be, part of them could be set aside for park and ride. So.
All right, so I'll pass it back to Carrie to finish off the last few slides.
All right. So we have the range of cost estimates that Kevin alluded to earlier. This is, again, assuming that this project would be eligible for the up to 80% of the federal funding. So for the low cost option on this range, we looked at the shortest route, which is from Bayshore to Northwestern Mutual at Drexel, which is about 17.3 miles long, 32 station pairs, which is roughly 64 stations, and 23 buses. In addition, we looked at this route as having 50% dedicated lanes for BRT, and 50% in a shared traffic without any separation on that dedicated lane. So just for costing, it makes a little bit of a difference. So that's the option, so the lowest cost option was estimated at 133.6 million. If you look at our pie chart there, you can kind of see how the costs are broken down, and big piece of pie over there that's in gray is called contingency. So as Kevin mentioned, at this level, we just don't have the engineering detail to have, really good cost estimates. So this is a ballpark figure, and that's, that kind of represents that sort of flexibility that we've put into this, into the estimate. So same thing on the high cost option. We do have that contingency there too. But the high cost option was for the longest route of the options, which is from Brown Deer down to Ascension Hospital in Franklin, roughly 23 miles, 36 station pairs, so about 72 roughly stations. And we say that because there are some that don't have a pair on the other side, like there's a Walmart that doesn't have a matching station on the other side. And roughly 27 vehicles would be required to run the service. So this option also considered that the whole route was dedicated with a lane separation. So some sort of barrier in between that transit lane and the traffic lane. So that kind of helped us get to that, highest cost option. And it's estimated to be $177 million roughly. And as we move forward into the tier 2 evaluation, we will have a little better range of cost for the final recommended option. So, all right, next slide. Oh, all right. So the next steps for the study. Here we are at October 2021, round 3 of public engagement. And so after this meeting, we are going to take all our meetings. We have, meetings on Wednesday and Thursday as well. So all of the feedback that we get at these meetings, we'll take that back, finalize the tier 1 evaluation, and continue on with our tier 2 analysis. And so by the fall winter of this year, we should have a recommended route in transit type that we're moving forward. Next slide. That will be called the locally preferred alternative once we do kind of get those transit type and the route approved by local governments. And then the county would request to enter project development to the Federal Transit Administration, which is kind of the first step to get to that that grant. And and then in the summer of 2022, Milwaukee County will identify that local funding source. So that's the 20% match, 20% or more, depending on how much federal funding that we get. So, and then the schedule after that, we got 2023 to 2025. The project will go through environmental documentation, design, and construction of the preferred option. So as they enter into the environmental phase and design, they'll continue public outreach. So this isn't the last crack at giving your opinions or your comments and on the project, because there will be a public outreach option as they move forward. So, and things may be tweaked a little bit as they look at that. So yeah, continue your involvement in the study, and hopefully they get good comments as they move through those phases. And then that puts us, depending how long those things take, that puts us at 2025 to 2027 with the transit service opening for service. So next
Yeah.
slide. I think then it's just our contact information. If you wanted to jot down our email addresses, or there's the project website address, and we do have some new documents posted on our library section of the website. So we do have a draft tier 1 document. We've got a full list of our public involvement that we've done so far, which I think Nikki mentioned earlier, and we'll have the other documents as well. We did also finalize our purpose and need document for those who have attended previous meetings. So we'll just continue posting those documents, including the tier 2 analysis when it's finished. And so stay posted on that. I think we have some more questions.
Yeah, we do have some questions, but I also just want to mention, just on that note, Carrie, that people who did attend this meeting, you will receive, and anyone on our email list, you'll receive kind of a follow-up email probably at the end of this week. After our meeting on Thursday, that is going to be another opportunity to provide comments. Again, we'll have some kind of, short surveys, and then we'll also include like a recording of this meeting. And that way, if you do have things that you think of after we're done tonight that you want to provide, those will be places you can provide them. Or if people that wanted to make it this week and just couldn't make one of the meetings, and could forward that to them, that would be great as well. So, but yeah, we do have a few more. One question was about frequency of the service.
Yeah. So we're looking at a similar frequency to the east-west. And so in the busy hours of the day, we're looking at probably a 10-minute frequency. So the bus would come every 10 minutes or so. And then, as it gets, the ridership goes down, we would probably spread that out a little bit more. But that's the highest frequency we're looking at. What materials would the stops use for the bus stop?
I think that's because I mentioned wooden platforms. I'm joking about the L. So yes, we'd expect, concrete surfaces on the floor, and then the shelters, could be a combination of things, but certainly we'll include some glass and things like that as well.
Okay.
And then the question from John, at least, is the next one I have, Carrie.
All right. Is vehicle maintenance, storage, et cetera, to be handled at existing MCTS facilities, or any upgrades for these facilities? I think for the most part, and Jeff Sponcia can jump in if he wants, but I think they were looking at handling these at an existing MCTS facility. And I think that was the Kinnikinnick garage. But of course, once they get into the details of what the vehicle type is and what can be handled there, I think that might be a final decision later. I don't know if Jeff is still on. Do you have any thoughts?
Harry, this is John. I'll just jump in there.
Oh, okay.
John, just to answer your questions, yes, we anticipate maintenance and storage of the buses at existing facilities. As in the case of the East-West BRT, whereby we're incorporating electric buses, we will be doing some station upgrades, charging equipment, electrical upgrades, that sort of thing. So depending on the sort of vehicles that are ultimately selected, we will do the necessary upgrades to the necessary facilities, the storage garages, as well as the fleet maintenance at Vine Street.
Okay, thank you. My concern is with the stop, the nearby gas station on 27th and Layton. Oh, the other Layton, right.
Yeah, Peter, so we, just to get at that question, so Peter's talking about a specific location on 27th and Layton and where the bus might drop people off. And, we haven't necessarily gotten down to that level yet as far as where at an intersection a station might be located, and what might be the best place. But thanks for that comment, because that is the sort of comment we can pass on to the design team when we transition to that part of the project, because they will be looking at that. And taking that into consideration is exactly the sort of thing that they'd be interested in knowing. People using wheelchairs or power chairs, generally speaking, either, so if the bus is level enough to the platform, they would be able to just wheel right on. Otherwise, the existing ramp system is available. The east-west BRT, the folding ramp that comes out of the front of the vehicle. The east-west BRT, there is a new securement system that the county is using for that, where power chair and wheelchair users actually secure themselves once they get on board, automatically, essentially. So the driver doesn't have to get out of their seat to assist in basically all circumstances. So that is a feature and faster for everyone involved. And David's putting some comments around frequency. Definitely agree on that. I think everybody would love to offer better frequency on the service if more funding becomes available for operations in the future. I'm sure this is one of the key corridors MCTS would try to enhance frequencies if they could. Yeah.
Yes, and we will have notifications of when the next bus is coming. Brian Peters asked that question. So yeah, you'll see like next bus in 2 minutes. They have it in Chicago. It's like a metro in DC. So it just helps you kind of plan for when the bus is coming.
Yeah, and Andrew and David talking a little bit about why they think a rail option is a better option. And, we certainly hear that, and there's definitely some validity to your points. It's not about, in my mind, this is just my opinion, it's not about thinking about advancing beyond the status quo. This region has had planning efforts for decades to invest in rail. And the streetcar is the only one that's succeeded in going to implementation. So it's really, given the limited resources we're working with, that's the focus of the study, is to try to get something done as soon as possible. If more resources become available, then these sorts of things could be reconsidered without a problem. And I think if transit funding in the county became more reliable and expanded, you would want to think comprehensively about what corridors you'd want to make those sort of investments in anyways, because you need those. There may be other corridors that are higher priorities, or maybe this corridor is the highest priority, but you'd want to think about that as well if you stumble on a few $1 billion. So.
Okay.
Few
All
more
right, so
comments.
getting more comments.
Yeah, we're happy to hang out here for a little bit, see if any other questions come in. And otherwise, thank you all for your time.
Yes, thank you for joining. And you will receive an email from us. And so provide as much comments, as much feedback as you can on these options, and we'll move forward. So thank you so much.